Welcome to the Fear and Greed Business Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. We talk a lot on this podcast about what house prices have done. It's a little more challenging to predict what they're going to do. But the team at Domain have done just that, using their data modelling to forecast what will happen to capital city and regional house and unit prices in the next 12 months. Dr. Nicola Powell is Domain's Chief of Research and Economics. Nicola, welcome back to Fear and Greed.
Thanks for having me on again.
It's mostly a story of growth, isn't it? Where are we going to see new records set based on your forecasts?
So we are anticipating growth largely across Australia. We're expecting stronger growth coming out of our capital cities compared to our regional markets. And we're seeing expecting stronger conditions in certain cities. We're expecting house prices to lead growth, and that's going to be led by Perth, Adelaide, Sydney and Brisbane. Perth really is that kind of winning story. We're expecting between 8 and 10% increase in house price between now and the end of next financial year. But it does mean more records. It does mean many of our cities are going to see another new record highs. That is with the caveat apart from Melbourne and Canberra. And Melbourne is probably that one city that I would pick out as the one that's still seeing really kind of sluggish conditions, really hasn't seen any movement in price. And it's pretty much been like that for the past 18 months.
Okay, so what you've just said then, those cities that do well, Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide, Sydney, that's a bit of a continuation of the last 12 months.
It certainly is, but what we are expecting is the pace of price growth is going to be lower compared to what we had been previously seeing. So when you compare it back to what's happened this financial year and even to the calendar year of 2023, we're expecting prices to rise, but just not as fast as they were. And I think it's really the product of affordability starting to bite. I think, the outlook might change if we see, a handful of rate cuts. I think once we start to see rates being cut, which we're not picking really until mid next financial year, once we see rate cuts, not that that's going to directly fuel price growth, but what it will do is help to improve consumer sentiment. And when you start to see better consumer sentiment, it's going to be amplified through our housing market, through housing turnover. We will see greater confidence, we will see greater demand and therefore higher levels of turnover, which could spark a little bit of further momentum in terms of price growth.
They're the cities doing well. What is about Melbourne that it just doesn't have the price growth?
And Melbourne really has been that one to buck the trend. And I think with Melbourne, it's highly unusual. You tend to find that Sydney and Melbourne price cycles do follow one another quite closely. And that's absolutely not been the case. We've pretty much seen Melbourne house prices stagnate for the past 18 months. We've pretty much seen them do nothing. And we're forecasting a pretty similar outcome for the next 12 months also. But what I think is really interesting for Melbourne is it is going to get to the point where it's perceived as being undervalued. It's built, that perception of value is building all the time. It's building now. And it will get to the point that the foundations are almost being set to see, once we get to the next property cycle, it is likely that Melbourne will overperform compared to our other capital cities, because it's highly, highly unusual. Because once we get to the end of next financial year, that's going to be, 2 and a bit years where we've really seen that market underperform compared to others. The biggest reasons have been supply has been better. Overall supply is 20% higher year on year. It's 18% higher compared to the 5-year average. It's also, I think, being impacted still by population dynamics. Population dynamics are still not back to what would normally be seen across Victoria, and that's really strong levels of interstate migration. It's still got a bit of that pandemic overhang in terms of that population not recovering. And then, of course, we can't not mention the taxation changes. And I think the taxation changes around land tax has really created a bit of a negative sentiment, particularly amongst investors. And all of these things together have really created those more mild conditions coming out of Melbourne.
Stay with me, Nicola. We'll be back in a minute. My guest this morning is Dr. Nicola Powell, Chief of Research and Economics at Domain. Okay, so the numbers you're talking about, particularly for those 4 cities, Perth, Brisbane, Adelaide and Sydney, they're quite high. I mean, is there a ceiling to house prices?
Look, they are quite wild, aren't they? When you have a look at where these prices are going to be by the end of next financial year. we've got more cities reaching that $1 million mark. And even if we push it that little bit further, so let's talk about to the end of 2025. At the end of 2025, we're picking that 5 of our cities are going to have a median house price of $1 million. So that's obviously Sydney, Melbourne, Canberra, which are already at $1 million housing markets. Brisbane's going to join it and is likely to be very close, just $1,000 separating its median house price to a median of $1 million by the end of the financial year. But once we get to the end of the calendar year, that's when cities like Adelaide are likely to join that $1 million median. So, it is, and absolutely there is a ceiling. And I think what you're seeing is a greater divide between those that own a home and those that don't, and those that have the family members that are able to financially support them to purchase a home and those that don't. And I think, it also shines a light on our need to densify our cities and also to have a diverse array of homes as well. And this is where units come in. Units are much more affordable. We need to make sure there are those stepping stones on the property ladder to help people on their home ownership journey.
So, I want to come back to the idea of densification in a moment, but why are we seeing this price rise? I mean, we have discussed this before, but just give us a reminder why right now we're getting this sort of somewhere between 7, 8, 9% price rises in these cities.
And look, there are many reasons, but I think for me, when I look at that forecast, it really showcases that the undersupply of housing that we have across Australia is still placing pressure on pricing. Ultimately, we've seen population growth, construction challenges, so these are some of the big reasons behind price growth. Ultimately, we've seen home building just hasn't been able to keep up with the level of population growth that we have seen. Population growth and demographic shifts have really shaped changes in our housing markets, not only from strong levels of movement between states and territories, but also overseas migration, but also things like fewer people per household, an increase in single households as well. This places greater needs from our housing markets. And so, and then throw in as well, we've got a very tight rental market too, particularly when you look towards those cities where we're expecting much stronger rates of growth, like Perth, like Adelaide, which have our tightest rental markets in Australia. I think that is placing pressure. It's fast tracking people's decisions to buy, obviously, if they can. So it is a bit of a melting pot of many things that have happened. But I think for me, it really shines the light on the undersupply that we have in housing.
So I think we're coming to densification, whatever that word means, Nicola. What you're talking about then, the undersupply, a way to fix that is for more people to live in, so increase the number of people per home. But presumably it's also a cheaper way to build homes is to build units. So we start living more in units. I mean, the sort of the quarter acre block and white picket fence, we don't think so much about that. We think much more about living in units. Is that how you expect it to go?
I think it's a mix. So densification doesn't necessarily mean just units and apartments. It comes in the form of duplexes, townhouses, terraced homes, townhomes. There's various types of that missing middle. So it's medium density too. And I think that it is, as you rightly say, it's cheaper to purchase, cheaper to build, but it's also cheaper to urban infill than it is to continue to build infrastructure, build schools, build, doctors and all the facilities that are needed in a new community. It is cheaper to infill within our cities around those infrastructure hubs, those transport nodes. That is where I think we need to see that focus. And we're seeing that focus, particularly in New South Wales, around, the upsizing of areas around certain infrastructure hubs. We have to remember that we do live in some of the least dense cities in the world. And there was a study out only last week where it was picked that Sydney was the second most unaffordable city in the world. But the number one was Hong Kong. And Hong Kong, we know, has full of apartments, is very small. But what you get in Australia is actually much more for your money. You're getting a larger home, a larger plot of land. And I do think that what we're seeing is a bit of a reshaping of what that Australian dream is. We do need to think about using the land that we have efficiently and effectively, ensuring that we are using the current housing stock that we have efficiently and effectively to make sure that we are, land is finite, make sure that we're providing enough homes in the right locations where people want to live.
Okay, this brings the idea of the regions into the discussion. People in Australia have always, well, not always, but primarily we're East Coast residents with a little bit in the West. We tend to live in big cities. What about regional cities? I mean, their price rises, you're not predicting them to be as much as the capital cities, but do you think there is a world where we do actually diversify a lot more, such as the US, for example, or many other countries, really?
I think it was a really interesting test case kind of during the pandemic and the ability to, in a hybrid way of working, that really was decentralization from the bottom up, because we suddenly proved, yes, we can work from home. We can work from home full time. We can work from home in a part-time capacity, obviously depending on the type of work that you do. I do think that really changed where people could reside. It opened up affordability. There's an element, though, that of the return to work that does change where you can live in terms of that commutable distance. And, this is where it does capture the regions too. I think what we've seen in terms of being able to work remotely, it's probably opened up that commutable belt and that little bit further away from our capital cities. In our regions, as you say, we're only expecting minor rates, pretty much flatline growth in our regional markets. And even regional Victoria is still expected to be below previous record highs. It's still not fully recovered. But what I think we'll see is a diversity in townships across regional markets. We're likely to see those that either have a bigger employment base or are within closer proximity to a bigger capital city are likely to see stronger rates of price growth than elsewhere.
Nicola, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thank you.
That was Dr. Nicola Powell, Domain's Chief of Research and Economics. This is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, daily business news for people who make their own decisions. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.